Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Baranof Island in southeast Alaska. The island is located just west of the Stickeen ice field, and its pronounced landmark, Devil's Thumb. On clear days, the entire ice field can be viewed from the peaks of Baranof Island, and the bleak and rugged territory can send the stomach of the most experienced outdoorsman into knots. The elevation here isn't particularly high, running between 3,500 and 5,390 feet at the peak of Mount Veniaminof, the highest peak in the Alexander Archipelago. The mountains here may not be all that high in elevation, but the steepness of the granite ridges is as rigorous as anywhere in the world. They jet sharply from the valley bottoms and reach their height quickly, granting mountain goats the rugged and rocky terrain they thrive in. In the valley bottoms, thick forests of Sitka spruce, western hemlock, yellow cedar, and mountain hemlock are stratified by their ideal elevation. The most prominent bushes here are blueberry bushes and thorny groves of devil's club. At points, these groves are so thick they are impassable and completely obscure any animals hiding there, even from only a few yards. Common animals on Baranof Island include mountain goats and Sitka black-tailed deer, and their predators are brown bears and human hunters. When the crossroads of these two apex predators intersect, they create dangerous and painful results for both parties. For the past few months, 3 friends have been planning to hunt for mountain goats on Baranof Island and have procured a professional guide to help them acquire a harvest in compliance with guidelines. Clint Adams and Matt Erickson were avid hunters and outdoorsmen. Clint's girlfriend, Melody Orozco, was not. Clint had invited Melody along on the hunting trip, but had some pushback from his own family and Melody's as well. Their concerns were regarding whether Melody was prepared to jump into the deep end of the hunting pool, with a remote backcountry experience being her first time hunting. Due to Clint and Matt's experience and the services of the professional hunting guide, they anticipated a routine and enjoyable hunting trip and decided to bring her along with them. The families weren't worried about the hunting group running into brown bears, as much as they were the rigors mountain goat hunting would impose on Melody. Clint had hunted in Alaska before, and knew that Melody would enjoy their time together, and this may be her only chance to participate, so they all decided all 3 would venture out together on the hunting trip. By the time October 14, 2022 rolled around, the 3 friends and hunters had found themselves bouncing across the bay from Sitka as a boat carried them toward Baranof Island. Upon arrival, they utilized an inflatable raft to ferry their gear across the large lake, which would bring them near the jumping-off spot for their goat hunt. As the rain pattered the rocks around them, the party hiked for 1.5 miles before pitching camp for the first evening. Concerned about the rain clouds limiting visibility, the hunters rose early on October 15, 2022, and were relieved to see clear skies. They packed their camping gear, worked their way to the top of the ridge, and looked for a good glassing spot to search for mountain goats. The weather at this time of year is varied, with snow being deposited at times. Slippery, frozen sections of the trail forced the hunters to utilize their ice axes to assist as they climbed the trail. About 400 yards above camp, the hunters were crossing a slope transition when the guide, whom we'll refer to as Bill, began to yell. Bill's words hit Clint's eardrums and invoked a rapid mental reassessment of his plans. The guide's terrified words, "Oh, run." Now, Clint Adams is a big man, standing at 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighing in at about 285 pounds. As soon as the guide's words registered in his mind, he could see Bill running in his direction. Clint stared in disbelief as Bill streaked past him, with his .375 H&H bolt-action rifle still draped across his shoulders. The situation was clearly too dangerous for him to pull his rifle from his own shoulders in his own protection. His eyes were as big as dinner plates, and he was terrified at whatever was chasing him. Clint turned his head back up the hill after the guide ran past and could see a huge brown bear thundering down the trail toward him. The bear's eyes were fixed on Bill, and it completely disregarded Clint's presence along the trail. Clint's hunting rifle was strapped to his backpack, and his only weapon he had immediate access to was his ice axe, which was still in his hand. As Clint watched the bear effortlessly stride its way down the steep and slippery slope, his mind raced, but reached no logical conclusion on what action to take. By the time the bear was within arm's length of Clint, he could see its eyes were still focused on Bill. He saw an opportunity to strike the bear and swung his ice axe with both hands and all of his might toward the bear's 5-gallon bucket-sized head. Now the pointed end of the ice axe is sharp and is about 8 inches in length. As the axe struck the bear, it hit right at the base of its skull and drove into the bear's neck, clean to the shaft. As the bear pursued Bill, it pulled the ice axe from Clint's hands as it raced past him. The bear seemed unfazed with the head of the axe embedded in its flesh as it pursued Bill down the trail. Within a matter of a few seconds it had caught up to him and crumpled him with a single blow of its paws to his backpack. Now Bill and the brown bear tumbled several yards down the slope, stopping at a relatively flat spot. As Clint watched, he could see the massive brown bear stand to its full height of 8 or 9 feet above the guide, with his ice axe still protruding from its head. Bill was still wrestling with his rifle, trying to point it toward the bear and shoot it. The guide fumbled with his rifle and managed to raise it, pointing toward the bear's head, and fired a shot that resounded off the mountainside. As Clint looked on, he could see the bear's fur ripple across its body as the blast from the shot expanded, and the muzzle blast flashed even in the daylight. The concussive wave generated by the high-powered hunting rifle seemed to stun the brown bear. Even though it wasn't struck by the bullet, it staggered back a few feet and seemed to re-examine its plan of attack. Standing off to the side and slightly above the attack, Erickson saw his chance to join the fray. He pulled out his .357 revolver from its chest holster and fired 3 shots in rapid succession at the bear. Brush between him and the bear prevented him from getting a clear shot, but he knew he couldn't pass on the chance to shoot the bear while it was on its hind legs. By now Bill had scrambled to his feet just as the bear charged back toward him. He had leveled his rifle at the bear from a distance of only a few feet and fired a second shot, just as Erickson fired 2 more from his pistol, as the rest of the party screamed, trying to drive the bear off. The brown bear boar seemed confused and overwhelmed at the loud gunshots coming from different places, screams, and people popping up randomly. Between the noise and confusion, it decided that bolting in the opposite direction would likely be its best choice. As it fled from the group of hunters, Clint's ice axe worked its way from being embedded at the base of its skull and tumbled to the ground, where it was recovered by Clint. With the bear having fled, the group stared at each other and checked to see if each of them was all right. After a brief discussion, they continued to the top of the ridge and glassed for mountain goats. As they glassed, they saw an even larger bear further up the mountain and decided they shouldn't press their luck any further. At this point, no one in the party had a single injury, and remaining in an area with such a high bear population may negatively affect that fact. They broke camp and made their way down the mountain and back to the lake shore at the base. They piloted their inflatable raft back across the lake and traveled back to Sitka for the night. In Sitka, Melody was shaken up. The men knew that bringing her back up the mountain was out of the question. They also knew that the weather would be turning bad in a few days, which left them with only the next day to hunt. Clint, Erickson, and Bill decided to return the next day for another attempt at getting a mountain goat. The men boated across a different lake and pitched camp above the tree line. Clint and Erickson shared a tent, but by 7:30 p.m. Erickson fell over asleep, apparently exhausted from the excitement of the prior day. Clint was still riding a wave of adrenaline, though, and played a card game by himself. Suddenly Erickson shot bolt upright in bed and yelled an agonized, "Ah!" shaking Clint for a moment. Clint stammered out, "What's up?" Erickson mumbled, still half asleep, "It was a nightmare. I was getting charged by a brown bear," before slumping back into his sleeping bag. I could find no summary of their day of hunting for mountain goats, but did gather Clint's thoughts following the bear attack. He stated the gunshot, especially from close range, appeared to deter the bear. While in the brush and with only a few yards of separation, he admitted that bear spray likely would have done no good to fend off the bear. He says after watching the bear's reaction to the rifle blast, he now arms himself with a loud air horn. He's growing convinced that overwhelming the bear's sense of hearing short-circuited its desire to attack Bill. He also advises that if you decide to carry a pistol, carry at least a 10mm and as large a magazine as you can get your hands on. Regarding the boar and how it fared after 2 high-powered rifle shots and 5 .357 revolver rounds were fired at it, as well as an ice axe being embedded in the base of its skull. There's no mention of if the bear died or survived. There's no discussion of any attempts being made to find it to check its condition. If it were struck by Bill's second rifle shot only, then it may have survived, even with Clint's ice axe wound to its skull. But if Erickson's round struck it, then its chances of survival would dramatically decrease with each round entering its flesh. Given there was no effort made to follow up on the bear's condition, we will never know if it died or somehow survived. After reviewing the facts around this episode, I am left with a few questions for you. Did the blast from the rifle drive the bear off, or did Erickson's .357 revolver rounds do the job? Do you think the bear could survive the wounds it may have potentially suffered? Would you have gone back up that mountain to glass for mountain goats after having such a terrifying altercation with a boar brown bear? I have no doubt I would not have. I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Admiralty Island in southeast Alaska. The island sits about 18 miles south of Juneau, the state's capital. On the island roam an estimated 1,500 brown bears, boasting the highest bear population per square mile in the state, with 1 brown bear per square mile. Even with the high population density of brown bears, injuries to humans are rare, and fatalities are even rarer. The native Tlingit called Admiralty Island Kutsnuwu, which translates into the Fortress of the Bear. Today's episode indicates that the Tlingit had a very valid reason to refer to the island in that manner. Admiralty Island is a rugged and remote area with elevations varying from sea level up to Eagle Peak, standing at 4,650 feet above sea level. Dense growths of western hemlock, Sitka spruce, and western red cedar crowd this temperate rainforest island. It is one of those rare places where visitors can find deer, salmon, and bald eagles, and view whales spouting in Kutsnahu Inlet from the island's only permanent settlement, the town of Angoon. The Hecla Greens Creek mine is one of the world's largest silver-producing mines, and also yields productive amounts of zinc, lead, and gold. It is an underground cut-and-fill operation, which means a layer of ore body is mined and target ore is removed from it. Afterward, the mined ore is placed back in the hole to support layers above, while the next layer is mined. This process repeats as the hole proceeds deeper into the mine area. At Greens Creek, Hecla practices green mining policies, which focus on restoration of environmental conditions to similar conditions as before the mine started. After graduating from high school in Hollis, Oklahoma, 18-year-old Anthony David Montoya had headed up to Admiralty Island after receiving and accepting a job offer from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho-based Timberline Drilling Company. Anthony would be helping collect core samples at Greens Creek Mine and would be working on a remote work site only accessible by helicopter. Anthony was a lively and energetic young man who always presented a smile. He was a little man who was protected by his larger teammates whenever he managed to get some cleanup minutes in the football team. They affectionately nicknamed Anthony Sharkbait, given he was such a small guy. He was known for masking his struggles by joking and making his friends laugh with his antics. His mother had passed away the prior June, and Anthony had dealt with hardship after hardship in his young life, but made sure you wouldn't know it by looking at him. He had worked as a ranch hand and at an auction house back in Hollis, where he was known for his work ethic. His 19th birthday was coming up on October 8th. The mining company had a long history of safety, and all employees received bear safety training, which educated them on bear behavior. The mine hadn't had a single bear-related injury since operations began in 1989. Topics like food and trash storage, bear behavior, and training on bear spray are emphasized in the safety courses. The company provides bear spray and trains personnel how to fire beanbags to frighten bears to keep workers safe. Just after 8 a.m. on Monday, October 1st, 2018, Montoya was working with a group of co-workers and reported that he needed to go to a water pump site a short distance away. He departed from the work site, and the others continued performing their duties, expecting Anthony to return in a few minutes after checking the pump. Now, Anthony had already had a few frightening run-ins with brown bears in his short time at the mine. He relayed one such run-in to his friend Audrey Manny on a phone call home. Anthony stated that he was out at the site when he ran into a bear, or a bear ran into him. The bear closed the distance between it and Anthony to the point where Anthony decided he needed to run. This isn't the prescribed reaction to a bear confrontation, but given his youth and athleticism, and likely a lot of luck, Anthony fled through the bush, making it back to the site in safety, with the bear in hot pursuit. At some point along the way, the bear gave up on its pursuit of him, allowing him to escape. This and other altercations with bears had Anthony rethinking his decision to work at the mine. Although his heart was huge, the danger the bears brought to the work site had Anthony thinking of finding employment in a safer environment, and soon. His underdog attitude and dedication to improving his difficult lot in life had been tested by the danger of working in such close proximity to brown bears. After Anthony's prolonged absence, his co-workers went to look for him. They arrived at the pump location and about 35 yards away could see 3 large brown bears standing over Anthony's corpse. The workers' approach was likely covered by the loud noise of the water pump, and it likely masked Anthony's approach as well. One of the workers, who was unnamed, shot all 3 bears before authorities could arrive. After dispatching the 3 brown bears, his co-workers approached his corpse and could see that the bears had fed on his body. He was clearly dead, and they could do nothing to save their friend, given the devastation to his body done by the feeding bears. After discovering Anthony's remains, mine personnel secured the area to preserve forensic evidence. They cooperated with federal and state authorities as the evidence was examined so that Anthony's death and the circumstances around it could be fully understood. His body was retrieved and taken to the Alaska State Medical Examiner's laboratory for an autopsy. According to sources, Anthony was found to have been killed by the sow and her cubs during the mauling after they caught him alone and unarmed at the water pump. The loud noise of the pump created a situation which made a surprise run-in with the bears almost unavoidable. Though his specific injuries were not indicated in any source I could find, the short time frame tells us that his injuries were likely substantial. In many cases in which a bear attack victim dies within a 20-minute time frame or less, it is frequently due to a substantial injury to the neck or the head. Although Hecla had done everything possible to avoid such a tragedy, they broadened bear awareness and safety programs for their contractors and employees following Anthony's death. Many corporations in the mining industry are known for disregard for environmental and employee safety, but after reviewing their company report from 2018, I have to admit I'm impressed with their initiatives. I've linked to this report for your review in the video article below this episode. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Would the construction of security fencing around work areas prevent further bear incidents for mine workers? Is it realistic to expect bears to avoid human conflicts with mineral extraction efforts in their habitat? Does the primitive and remote area that bears thrive in require human industry to yield to them, or is there a compromise that can be reached? I'll gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comment section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Gallatin National Forest, just a few miles northwest of Yellowstone National Park in Montana. This national forest abuts the park, and the peaks here rise to over 10,000 feet in elevation. In the valleys, pine, fir, and spruce trees form dark timber, in which elk, mule deer, and moose meander. There's a murderer's row of predators here, which include black bears, bobcats, coyotes, cougars, wolves, and the fiercest of them all, grizzly bears. In the months leading up to the fall of 1992, 39-year-old Mark Matheny and his 49-year-old hunting partner, Dr. Fred Bonson, had planned to archery hunt for elk and deer together. Mark was a general contractor by trade and lived in Gallatin Gateway, just a few miles south of Bozeman. He had a lengthy list of famous people as his customers. Dr. Bonson was a medical doctor from Bozeman, Montana. In the months leading up to archery season, Bonson had been researching the use of pepper spray as a repellent to bears and how it may prevent an attack. He'd purchased a can of pepper spray called Karate in a Can and was planning on bringing it along with him as he hunted this fall. He even made himself a leather holster to carry the spray along with him as he hunted. Mark thought the doctor's idea was a good one and had planned to purchase his own canister for himself, but during the bustle of business and life, forgot to buy it by the time archery season had rolled around. This season his complacency would come back to bite him in a very literal sense. Mark was a traditional bow hunter, meaning that he preferred to use archery equipment modeled after bows used centuries ago. Longbows are slightly bent shafts of Pacific yew or another wood that springs back to original form once the tension on the limbs is released. The ends of the bows are connected with a string of catgut, which resists the stress placed on the limbs of the bow by stretching just enough to shoot the arrow from the setup. In the morning of September 25th, Mark and Dr. Bonson were gathering their archery equipment before hiking up the hill to hunt. They were looking over the thin layer of snow that had fallen overnight and eager for the day's adventure.
After hiking up to a promising patch of timber, they'd successfully bagged a nice 4-point mule deer buck. Following gutting the deer, they said a quick prayer of gratitude. Before departing, they suspended the buck's carcass from a tree to cool out for the night, planning to return for the carcass the next day with their children. As the day passed, they were working their way back toward camp. The warmth of the day had melted the small amount of snow that had fallen, and the damp earth made walking nearly silent. Mark was about 80 feet ahead of the rest of the archery hunters and crested a small rise in the trail when 2 flashes of movement in the timber to his left caught his eye. Mark's head snapped in the direction of the movement, and he could see 2 yearling cubs flying into the air, only about 35 yards from him. Unbeknownst to Mark, the 2 grizzly cubs were getting breakfast from a sow, and their mama wasn't happy to see Mark so close to her babies. The sow was so surprised and alarmed by Mark's sudden appearance that she had sprung to her feet, tossing her cubs as she did so. She wasn't waiting to see what Mark was doing, and immediately charged toward him with a ferocious look in her eyes. Mark turned around in a near panic, looking for a tree to climb. Realizing he had very little time before the sow closed in on him, he sprinted toward Bonson in hopes he could stop the sow with a pepper spray he'd packed with him. As Mark dashed toward Bonson, he yelled, "It's a bear! Get your spray!" Seeing the terror in Mark's eyes, Bonson reached down toward his belt and the homemade leather holster for his spray. Seeing the bear close in on both of the men, and having no success at pulling his spray from its holster, Bonson dove into some bushes just off the trail. Mark saw his hunting partner dive into the brush and knew the sow must be very close behind him. Off the trail a few yards, he could see a large deadfall log on the ground. He sprinted toward it and hunkered down behind it, hoping it would grant him some kind of protection from the sow's fury. Even as the sow raged only a few feet from Mark, he admired her majesty and power. Her coat shimmered in the dappled shadows, and her massive size he guessed at around 400 pounds. But the sow wasn't there to be admired. She'd come to remove the threat to her cubs, and was now closing in on Mark from only a few feet away. Mark's momentary admiration gave way quickly to terror. He began to yell at the bear, and thrust his bow toward her in a feeble attempt at frightening her. With a swat of her paws so quick that Mark couldn't tell which paw she'd used, she sent the bow flying from his grasp. The sow's open mouth with long glimmering teeth filled Mark's vision, and he stuttered a plea to God for help as he dodged her jaws. His resistance was useless as she bounded toward him and bit onto his face. Mark could feel the tissues of his face giving way to the force of the sow's jaws as she tore his flesh away from his bones. As soon as she ripped one mouthful of flesh loose, she would release and bite again into the flesh of his neck. As she tossed her head with her mouthful of Mark's flesh, she threw him violently to his back. The bear straddled him and drove her teeth through his skull, just above his eye socket. Mark couldn't hold back and yelled, "She's got my head! She's killing me!" But his panicked calls for help only energized the grizzly's attack. I've heard it said that once a person comes to grips with the fact that they're about to die, a peace comes over them. This is the only explanation I could think of that would allow Mark to feign death and go limp. As he felt the sow's jaws cracking his skull, his mind drifted off, and he was overwhelmed with how much he would miss his wife and kids. He knew his life was about to come full circle, and that eternal glory he'd hoped for would soon be before him. That is when Bonson charged back into the fray. He had finally pulled his pepper spray out of the leather holster and ran, screaming, toward the bear as it attacked Mark. Like 2 ancient warriors, meeting in the pitched heat of battle, the sow released her grip on Mark and spun toward Bonson. Just as the sow approached Bonson, he released a short blast from the pepper spray canister right into the sow's face. The pepper spray filled her eyes and nostrils, and the sow swatted him on his side, spilling him onto the forest floor. Mark was certain that his hunting partner was now suffering a similar fate that he had. He tried to crawl, to get as far away from the angry sow as he could. As soon as she noticed him moving, the sow spun back in Mark's direction and bounded toward him once again. Mark knew that it was futile to run from such an athletic and powerful animal. She had caught him previously in very little time, just moments before, and that was prior to his injuries. He lifted his hands above his head, hoping to protect his head and neck from further damage, as she once again leapt upon him. Using her enormous mass, she crushed him to the ground. Mark's arms were outstretched in an attempt to fend off her jaws, so she bit onto his forearm and tossed her head violently back and forth. The overwhelming stench of rotting elk meat filled Mark's nostrils as it wafted off of her as she shook him about. In a premonition of the death he was about to experience, Mark realized she had an elk carcass cached nearby and been feeding on it just before he had surprised her. Once again, Mark went limp and feigned death. The sow's attack slowed, and she stopped tearing and biting him. Now believing her charge to protect her cubs was only partially complete, she focused her rage back on Dr. Bonson. Now standing up and only about 10 feet from the bear, Bonson released the full contents of his 4-ounce pepper spray canister into the sow's mouth, nose, and eyes. The effects were immediate this time, as the sow started retching and gasping. The pepper spray took the will to fight from her, and she bounded off into the timber, followed by her 2 cubs. Bonson dashed to Mark's side and asked him, "Are you all right?" His medical background came into good use as he assessed Mark's injuries. Whether it was optimism or reluctance to acknowledge the seriousness of Mark's injuries, Bonson soothed Mark by telling him he would survive. He set to work reattaching Mark's cheek with a pressure bandage. He triaged as many of Mark's wounds as he reasonably could before helping him back to his feet. The hunters knew that getting back to medical treatment was vital, so they made their way down the trail toward their vehicle. As a gash on his scalp trickled blood into Mark's eyes, he began to have trouble seeing. The trail was blurry, and every dark tree looked like a grizzly standing on its hind legs, getting ready to attack. He was nearly overcome with dizziness and fought to stay conscious as they walked. He was certain the sow had shattered his arm, as the pain from it was more unbearable than the pain from his other injuries. The walk back to the Jeep only took about 20 minutes, and as they approached, Bonson took a photograph of Mark's injuries, just for posterity's sake. As soon as Mark glanced into the rearview mirror, the full horror of his injuries set in. Pain that had previously been dulled by adrenaline, and the unfamiliarity of the extent of his injuries, was now crippling him. His head and face pounded each time his heart beat. Bonson drove the Jeep as fast as he reasonably could to get Mark to the hospital in Bozeman. Once there, the doctor tended to Mark's wounds for 7 hours himself. Mark's cheek had been ripped from his cheekbone, which tore his jaw muscles and salivary glands. The sow's second bite missed severing Mark's jugular vein by 1/8 of an inch when she bit into his neck. One of the sow's canines had punched clean through the thick portion of Mark's skull just above his eyebrow. Her canines had also punctured his skull toward the top of his head. It took 15 inches of suture to close the wounds on Mark's face, head, and neck. He'd lost a pint of blood due to his injuries. The pain in his arm was due to bruising, as it wasn't broken or dislocated. In an attack that lasted less than half a minute, the sow had left Mark with scars for life, and a headache that lasted for 2 years following the attack. Dr. Bonson didn't get off without an injury during his short tussle with the grizzly either. She'd bitten him on his side, but due to the thickness of his jacket, her teeth didn't pierce his skin. Either from a swat from her paws or by the pressure of her mass, she had separated a few of his ribs from his sternum and bruised and scratched up his side. As he healed, Mark returned to his job as a general contractor, but his constant headache made it difficult. He couldn't get his mind off of bears and how to avoid their attacks. He tried to relieve his focus by immersing himself in the outdoors as much as possible, but knew he had to do something more to help prevent bear attacks. After some time, a pepper spray company had reached out to Mark to ask him to be a spokesman for their product. He appeared at a sportsman's expo and afterward decided to quit contracting as a pepper spray salesman for the company. Mark wanted people to be safe from bear attacks and was constantly thinking of ways to improve the product of the company. He mentioned to them that if they developed a hotter spray formula that hung in the air more and added a luminescent safety clip, their product would be easier to find in the dark and more effective. He advised them that the trigger guard should be tethered to the holster so that it couldn't be lost as easily. Sadly, the company was reluctant to implement Mark's suggestions, so he decided he would need to develop the product he envisioned himself. Mark took out a loan against his property in 1994 and formed the Universal Defense Alternative Products Company, or UDAP for short. Over the coming months, he developed, marketed, and sold a pepper spray product specifically designed to aid in the prevention of bear attacks. Mark chose to use the photograph that Bonson had taken of him immediately following his attack in the marketing of his product. The picture is now one of the most iconic and famous bear attack photos of all time. I've linked to UDAP's site below so you can view it for yourself, as I cannot use it in this video due to it being copyrighted material. Today, UDAP's bear sprays come in all sorts of makes and models. They reportedly dispense a spray twice as hot as their competitors and in a shorter amount of time. They've been proven effective on all bears, moose, cougars, and even wild hippies. Mark's innovative ideas led to the development of a chest holster, which allows hikers to be hands-free and puts the bear spray canister close to where it's utilized. Mark's enthusiasm to keep the public safe broadened into discussions on bear safety on television and radio shows and presentations in schools to children. Lessons on how to interpret bear behavior and dispense bear spray are offered by UDAP as well. Mark describes his product this way: UDAP isn't brains in a can, but it sure is insurance in a can. He believes that his driving purpose that guided him to develop this product was the desire for people to enjoy the beauty God created for us without all the fear. As a final note, bear spray has a shelf life of about 3 years for peak efficacy. It may lose potency after that time period, so the investment every few years may save your life or a loved one's, and the expired cans can make great practice tools. Well, folks, that is how a terrible grizzly bear attack led to one of the best products on the market to prevent them. I think it beats out Troy Hurtubis's bear suit idea, personally. What do you think? After reviewing the details of this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Given Mark was hunting with a physician who was packing pepper spray for the first time in his life, was this attack something written in the stars? How did you feel when you knew the sow and her cubs fled, uninjured and alive? How important are the weather and conditions in avoiding a bear attack? If you use bear spray, post your preferred brand in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.